Hello. I thought I'd, for a change, do a short introduction to the podcast that I did with Minter Dahl just a few days ago. We're talking about artificial intelligence. Now, if you're a software entrepreneur, if you've got a software development company, well, I don't think there's many of you who are thinking that's not relevant for me, because the truth is it's going to affect everybody, but particularly the software industry. You may remember the name Minter Dahl. I had him on a podcast probably going back about 18 months ago. He was a really good guest, fascinating chap to speak to. So he came back when he finished the second edition of his book, which is Heartificial Empathy, talking about artificial intelligence and how it will be used. But as always, I like to keep the podcast sort of very relaxed, not scripted in advance, and we strayed off subject, as I tend to and quite often like to do. The other thing I'd like to say is that if you've been listening to the podcast regularly, you will see that it doesn't come out on a regular basis. I'm not doing so many podcasts a month or even a week. It really does depend on my own work schedule, and particularly over the last few weeks, it's been very, very busy. But generally, over the last 3 years, it has been an incredibly busy time. And I speak to obviously a lot of people, a lot of software entrepreneurs, people who are running some quite large software companies, and that's on, all of the continents. Although I'm based in the UK, do speak to probably more often people in the US actually, rather than in the UK, because that's where a large part of the software industry is. But if there are particular topics that you would like me to cover, if there are people perhaps that you know who you think would be really good on Boss It, then please do reach out to me. And if you've got a good story to tell that is relevant to other software entrepreneurs, then again, please do come and speak to me. But for now, have a listen to the podcast I did with Minter Dahl a few days ago. I think you enjoy it. Really nice guy. Okay, now we're going to have another episode of the Boss It podcast, and we're inviting back somebody we've had on this show before, which is Minter Dahl. Had a very interesting conversation with him last time, and hopefully we'll have the same again. But you've got a new book that you've just recently published. Wanted to catch up with you. So welcome to the show, Minter.
Mark, always a pleasure to chat with you. Let's hope it's fun and different.
Yes, exactly. After our last podcast, the thing that I really remembered immediately afterwards was you told me about the documentary that you had directed about your family, and I went and had a look. Excellent documentary, by the way. And I was really impressed with the IMDb rating, 8.5 out of 10. That's one of the highest out there. So congratulations
because there haven't been millions of people who voted.
No, maybe not, but it was really an interesting story, and stories are very important to everybody. It helps to convey information, helps people organize things. But when it's entertaining and informative like that, I think it's really good. I get involved in a lot of drama. I'm currently writing some plays as well, and that story element is so integral to that. But let's talk a little bit about your book. You can see it behind you, Heartificial Empathy. What's that all about?
Well, it was the book originally came out in 2018 when I was sensing, actually, first and foremost, a need for more empathy in business. And as I would talk to leaders, they kept on saying, oh, yeah, right. Well, kind of. And well, let's make my team, or let's make my salespeople, but not me.
Yeah.
And the idea was, I just got the sense that, well, if they can delegate it, they will. And well, maybe we can make the rest of the team, maybe we can make our sales consultants be more empathic, but I don't have to be. And maybe we could even make artificial intelligence empathic, because I don't want to be. And so that was sort of like the beginning piece of this. And so the idea of delegating empathy. So if that's what you want to do, here's the plan. Start with you. Because the idea of delegating it out and that you don't need to be is bahonky tonk if you want to change culture. So I wanted to craft something that kind of gave that hook of, oh, good news, I don't have to do it. I can delegate it. But the bad news is the first half of the book basically has his finger pointing right at you saying, you know what? Here's why you need to think more deeply about empathy. And if you want to go about delegating it, you need to have it in order to be able to appropriately encode it.
So there's nobody pushing against saying we don't need to have more empathy, but you feel that they're probably playing lip service and not taking it on board themselves. It needs to be much more part of the almost the DNA of the business and come from the top. Would that be a
Well,
fair summary?
sort of, except that 79% of CEOs, it's roughly 80% in two different surveys, indicate that if they are empathic, they risk or they feel they will risk losing respect. And so there actually is a resistance to the concept of empathy, or at least the one that they have in their heads. And then second of all, it's, I don't have time for that stuff. And it's true. The issue is you have to make time for it. You can't just sort of put it on a magic stick and make it happen. So there needs to be intentionality. So on the one hand, there's a blockage, like, oh, well, I'm going to be looked like I'm weak if I'm being empathic, or I can't be too nice. I got to do shit. I got to make decisions. And there's a misunderstanding in that of what is empathy. And so what part of my mission is to clear up what is empathy, why and how to bring it into your enterprise in a way that makes total sense. And by the way, will make you a better human being.
Well, that's a good start. Let's start off with the first of those. What is empathy within an organization?
All right.
Maybe you can give
So,
us some examples.
yeah, well, empathy within an organization, of course, is about human to human relationships. That's the core component of it. So empathy within an organization. Well, empathy, what is it? Empathy is understanding the other person. Broadly speaking, we always say get in the shoes of somebody else. But I like to break it down into two elements. One is understanding cognitively what someone in front of you is thinking, feeling, or experiencing. So thinking, this is the rational piece, feeling is the emotional, and the experience is sort of their context. And when you understand that better, it doesn't mean you're giving into it, doesn't mean you're agreeing with it. You're just understanding it, and hopefully without judgment. And this is the piece that really is fascinating about empathy in a business context. There's another side to empathy, which a lot of people talk about, which is the feeling side or the affective side of empathy, where you feel what the other person's feeling.
Which is very important in business when you're dealing with prospects and customers, because it's that feeling that they will tend to remember when they've forgotten the detail.
That's so true about storytelling. You know, they won't remember what you said, but they'll remember how you made them feel. This is very true. And the issue is that it's much harder to learn this affective empathy than it is to learn the cognitive side of empathy, to understand. And so in the first part, when you're talking about cognitive empathy, it's really understanding the person. Just like, oh, what do I see here? What are they saying? What are they feeling? And I can describe that. The other one is I'm feeling it. And it's much harder to learn to feel what someone else is feeling. It takes another type of mindset. So which is why I really split them in two, because I really focus on the cognitive empathy, which is something that can distinctly be learned if you have the desire.
Where would you see that quite often falling down within a business? Say, for instance, a software business, that's the audience that I talk to. Where would you see that breaking down and there being a lack of empathy?
Well, that's a loaded question there, Mark. So yeah, I'm going to start with the top. It breaks down at the top, and for a number of reasons. People who are running businesses who are successful tend to be empathy starved or empathy struggle to have empathy. They tend to be bullheaded. They tend to think, well, I'm successful. Why do I need to change? I'm successful. I can just say what needs to be said, and that's all there is to it. And this typically is the wealthy bias. If you're wealthy or successful, you don't really care about everyone else's opinions. That's just the statistics or the surveys show.
Mm.
The second thing is that oftentimes in software or tech areas, you really need to be very logical about how you program. And coders are known to be logical people. If you get a whacked out creative coder, it can be good, it can be interesting, but it's probably not going to be empty of bugs. So the issue with empathy is that logic and empathy are poor bed partners. So on the one hand, there's the empathy among the coders. And so if you want to encode empathy into your software, your chatbot or whatever, you need to understand the coder mentality and help them through with that. So you might want to bring on board some people who have done arts, literature, who write plays, for example, and have that kind of humanity invested in the beginning process. There's another piece which is very interesting because typically coders, once again, aren't so empathic. They're very good at what they do. There's a thing called coder empathy. And this is something I came across when I was visiting the University of Texas in Austin, where the coders who are working on an 8x3 schedule across the world would work until, let's say, 4 o'clock and then hand it off to another team that was 6 hours different. And that team would then take it over and code for 8 hours, then hand it over to the third team and so on. The coder empathy was actually in the way you hand off. And they were really leaning into this idea of, what do you think your coder in other country, other language, other culture is going to need in order to really get running quickly? You might say, hey, Mark, it's really great I'm hand over, can't wait for this. By the way, check out line 34. I really had to struggle with that. If you could fix it, or I don't know. The manner with which you transmit as a coder, that's a thing. So it's not something that would typically be thought of in advance. So maybe you need to bring that in, talk about the challenges of empathy in a tech world. That's something that would be enhance your tech coding, if that's something you do.
The point that you made earlier, that you see a lot of the leaders tend to be you described it as bullheaded and lacking in empathy. Don't you think now that there's been a change with new generations growing up with a less dictatorial type of way of running business, with less levels of management, which means that a leader who has much better empathy and consequently can communicate more effectively? Because I think the downside of not having empathy is quite often is your audience will shut off. They will pick up on that and they will just close off and they stop listening. Don't you think that should encourage leaders that, yes, they're ambitious and they're goal orientated, but they also have more empathy now because the business environment has changed?
Well, the statistics would tend to show, and I'm not privy to specific sector empathy within leadership.
No,
but
sure.
The statistics tend to say that on balance, leaders think of themselves as more empathic than they are perceived as being. And that number has stayed pretty constant, the delta between how empathic I think I am. And generally speaking, by the way, 75% of us think that we are above average empathic. and around 50% of employees will tend to think that their leadership is empathic. So that's just is empathic, not above average, right? So there's a big gap between what you think you're doing and what you are. And there's another piece, which is that when you're running the company, you may not be bullheaded. You may want to be appropriate in the way you communicate, but time, pressures, and performance stress often knock it out of us.
Yes, that's true.
So when you have like a prepared speech, okay, you're going to think about it. You're going to think about who's listening. But when you're caught under the gun, or a person blocks you when you're, or interrupts you in a hurried moment, you're harried, your ability to be empathic in those moments declines precipitously. And even if that person was coming to you with some sort of personal heartache, you don't have time for it. The way you manage that moment can make or break that relationship. And so, and I'm not saying that's a terrible thing, because the reality is that that boss also needs empathy, because that boss is under tremendous pressure to perform. And today we also have a workforce that demands a lot of empathy and may not give as much. So back to the perception piece. So it's a hard thing to do. This is the truth, Mark. This is a very messy thing to want to try to put in place, having an empathic culture. You can't be empathic all the time with everybody, everywhere. So we have to move away from seeking to be perfectly empathic,
yes,
to being more empathic.
yeah,
and that's the key point, because within that you have to know where you're starting.
yes.
If I don't know, if I think of myself as above average and I want to be more empathic, but you're viewed as way under.
Yes. Yeah. If you believe that you're well over, why focus on that? Because I'm doing okay, and actually they're not. They're well below average, and that's true for many areas of business. I see that a lot. It's sort of an illusion that they're selling to themselves. And I
Which
can
comes with
understand
this
that.
success bias, right? Look at me, I'm
Yes.
successful, I'm doing things, I've done things
So
before.
I
They
must be good.
hired me for this, so I
Yes.
must be good. And here's a like empathy can be a little bit of a vague piece, but or at least abstract. Listening, on the other hand, is quite concrete, and it's a good proxy for empathy. How well do you listen?
Yes. Yeah, that's a skill that I've been involved in sales training in the past, and it was the biggest problem with most salespeople. If you address the listening part, I always used to use the old saying about you have two ears and one mouth, use it in that proportion. If you really got that point through to them, immediately their performance would increase. Ignoring any of the other skills, just listening and responding to what that person was saying, rather than I've got a pitch and I'm going to make these 6 points. That would make a really big difference. Bringing this back to what you mentioned about AI, how much can AI help here in providing empathy? Because I have seen examples, spoken to companies whereby probably areas of a business when, for instance, the NHS at the moment, or anywhere where you're perhaps put through to a call center where somebody is being judged on the number of calls that they make in a day and maybe incentivized, that can be a very unsatisfactory process. You're calling them, you perhaps they are a supplier or maybe a potential supplier, and you need a piece of information, or you need something to happen, and it's just very much they're trying to get you off the phone with the shortest answer possible, and not really listening. Is that an area where you think that AI can be used successfully, or is AI not the solution at the moment?
So, broadly speaking, there are three areas where the interplay of empathy and AI can work in your business. And so the first one is around assisting you to be more empathic. So this is done already with certain software companies, Genius AI, where they assist a human being in formulating more empathic responses. So this is typically in customer service. KLM, the airline company, uses their services. And what the program does is that it captures all the data possible on an incoming call or an incoming email. This person has contacted us 6 times before. This is what's happened, 4 resolved, 2 not. And this is what they like usually. They like it short sentences and no emoticons because they don't think that's funny, for example. And then you have a question. The AI can scan the question and formulate 4 possible responses. The agent then says, I think the second one would be better for this one, and inserts copy paste. And they are graded, those responses, for their level of empathy. Pegasystems is another company that does the same thing with interaction. So this is the idea of augmenting human interaction.
I think Zendesk recently released the fact that they're starting to use AI, which made a lot of sense. I'm not sure exactly how they're using it, but I assume something along similar lines.
And the idea here, in these 2 cases specifically, they've been looking at the empathy factor. So I don't know about Zendesk, but that's the zone that's really of interest to me is how do you chronicle, if you will, empathy. The second one is making your AI, which is interacting with automatic chatbots, more empathic, thinking about those types of automatic relationships where there's no human involved. Could be, for example, on how you filter your telephone calls that comes in. Your call is important to us. Thank you for calling. We'll put you on hold for 8 hours.
Yes.
How can AI do in an empathic manner, help that, farm it out to the right people? Again, it could be about farming it out and preparing someone in the right way. Where Amazon, for example, they're quite interesting in the way that they hand off between agent and AI. But anyway, so that's within the automatization of what you're trying to achieve and how you're operating. And this could be true for how you do your marketing, what copy paste you do from ChatGPT. But anyway, there's all sorts of ways that empathy can be inserted into the AI as it pertains to your interactions and your business dealings. The third, and possibly the most interesting one, is in thinking about empathy within AI, it's going to help you craft a better understanding of what is empathy. A lot of the work that we're doing with AI is actually a great opportunity to have a mirror on who you are. Just like generative AI is actually a mirror of the sum total of all the internet, which is us. When you are specifically trying to make an AI for your business relative to your culture, your clients, which needs all sorts of finessing and personalizing, it's an opportunity to see who you are, because the mistake would be to make your AI perfect when you guys are a bunch of dum-dums. You want to have some kind of alignment between the way you operate internally, the way you are human to human, and the way the machine will work. So understanding your ethical framework in the transparent human to human and still messy world, and bring those ethics and that empathy into your AI. So that's sort of more a philosophical standpoint, but there's definitely value in thinking about yourself when you are trying to humanize your AI.
That's an interesting point, because I think the software sector's at one of those points where there's going to be a lot of change. And looking back, we've sort of been through several stages of development for the software sector, going back to maybe the 1980s, where things started out with some of the more progressive companies wanting to implement the PC or the mainframe with software, and software was being written for them. Then you tended to have sort of standardized on-premise software. Then we moved to cloud and SaaS. And the software companies realized that they could make much more money by having one solution fits all. Now with AI, I think that we're entering a completely different stage, whereby the knowledge and experience that a company has can be incorporated into the technology that they're using to give further IP, genuine IP for that organization, which is, this is what we know about this sector, but what we know about operating to that particular group of companies. And having AI and using empathy could be part of that completely unique solution, technology solution for that company. That becomes very interesting.
100%. And the key word for me in all of that becomes the data, because your relationship with those clients creates the data and the learning set. And when you really hone down and look at that, and you do appropriate tagging, human-based tagging as well as automated tagging, but that becomes your IP. At least that will become, along with appropriate algorithms and figuring out how to do the machine learning piece, will become an ability to accelerate your difference. I think absolutely.
Mm. And this goes back to one of the points that you made earlier, and the real valuable empathy is about knowing your audience and understanding their needs and their requirements, which can be quite unique. At the moment, as I think I mentioned to you, we're writing a book, and this is for software CEOs. Well, we're going to write that in a very different manner to if we were writing it, for instance, for software coders or for students,
or for pharmaceutical CEOs.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. It's a very different approach. And that's part of the empathy. That's part of improving the communication. I suppose there's a courtesy there as well, isn't it? It's thinking about how you're delivering your message to be more courteous, to realize that if you're talking to a software CEO, typically they're above average intelligence, they're very well educated. You don't need to explain to them necessarily in detail all the basics. You can start maybe at a different level.
The word courteous is a lovely word, and I certainly think that the world needs more courtesy.
Yes.
I would put it in a little bit of a different bucket just as yet. So listening and empathy go hand in hand. Tailoring to, and for example, making it more curt for some, shorter,
yes.
explicitly, that's interesting. That might be perceived as courteous, but I want to make sure that we're not talking about being nice, because people tend to think of it as wobbling into that area.
Yes.
Where I fundamentally talk about those two things at the same time is that listening and empathy, like politeness, takes effort. You don't, and a sense of manners, if you will. Those they don't just happen by mistake. You've got to open the door. You've got to think about the other person's carrying a heavy luggage. Oh, can I help you carry the luggage? Because, by the way, they may not be. They might be offended. They might be scared of you. And so they're being a helping hand, which is sort of the output of empathy, may not be what's required. Empathy is just understanding the situation. Then being polite or being quick or being helpful or being standoffish might be the most empathic solution. And people tend to, I like to keep this separate, this idea of how you act.
Yes. Yes. And the point you make about it's not about being nice. I think that there can be an association with being nice in being very malleable, agreeable to everything. And that's not what's needed in business.
But sometimes it is, but it's certainly not always.
That's right. But not always, where you can get somebody who's often described as being nice, but they're always very agreeable, and that doesn't work. No, that's a very interesting aspect of this. Where are you seeing, or where do you think that the biggest opportunities are today? Because this is a journey that organizations need to go on. Where do they start? What's the first step, and where are the biggest opportunities? Because I think with something like this, an organization wants to see what their ROI is.
Perfect. So first point of call is, I really feel like it, and it should be for every time. How clear is your strategy? And if everybody has a strategy down pat, then that allows you to say, well, now, how can empathy help me with my strategy? Because that's really what counts, right? Then once if you've got the strategy laid out, and that's dead clear to everybody throughout the organization, because that's usually not the case.
Yes.
Then when you want to apply empathy, the question is, how authentic or genuine are you in understanding your culture of empathy within the organization? Are you genuinely an empathic organization? And the key point here, Mark, is to consider this inside out. In other words, start with amongst your peers at the boardroom, in the boardroom, the board of governors, and then down through the executive committees and so on throughout the organization. What's your level of empathy in your organization? And be real about that. Because if you're very far away and there's a whole lot of anger and disappointment, just saying, well, now we're going to do an empathy program is the greatest way to get a lot of eyes rolling.
Yes.
And so once you have that in place, then you can really go forward towards being more empathic. And as to where is the greatest opportunity, I'm not really specifically knowledgeable about your sector, but what I can feel is that there is an incredible amount of anxiety, unhappiness, disengagement, loss of purpose in our society. And that goes for everybody, obviously your customers, distributors, and really specifically your employees. Mm. So the biggest opportunity for empathy is to apply it in crafting a better culture within, and hopefully help everybody understand how they can contribute to a purpose that your organization exists for, which has to be, in my opinion, above and beyond the idea of making the shareholder wealthy. In fact, it also should be above and beyond making you, your employees wealthy, or even just your customers happy. It needs to be something about how the world would be worse off if you didn't exist. And that whole crafting of purpose and inserting it throughout the organization is something where empathy can play a tremendous role. Because when you know why you're working and why you feel good about what you're working, boy, then you bring all sorts of discretionary energy to the workplace, and that will give you a competitive advantage unlike anybody else.
Mm. How do you start on this? How would you measure? Because one of the points you made is that it's important to understand where you currently are in that empathy scale. Are there effective measures for where, as an organization, and where you are as an individual, how empathetic you are?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and the answer is sadly no easy answer. No. My good friend Lena Rancevich and I are running a session on making empathy count. And the idea there is to learn how to count empathy as well. She's a techie and has got the startup that really looks at empathy as a criterion for evaluating and recruiting new personnel. And so here's the deal with this: is basically that discussion at the boardroom about how we want to measure empathy should be all by itself an extraordinarily enlivening piece of the discussion, because it's going to help you understand what it is, what it's not, what should we do, how are we going to measure it, how important is this to us? And the mistake some people will make, well, we're going to put it as a new value on our board. No. That should be happening way after you've done the program, where you actually can prove that that's what you are. And then again, I would even say that's sort of like writing "we're human" on a board. But
yes.
So then once you've got it, you know why you're doing it related to your strategy, then you might think about how you want to measure it within the company, what kind of feedback loops you're going to be having in. So the CEO is going to put out a list whether are you going to do a 360 version of it or not, and what type of questions you want to do. CVS in the United States, pharmacy brand, they used a poll, basically very simple: how empathic do you think the service was today with their customers? That's how they wanted to do it. So, but they did it religiously on that, and that's a pulse at a moment in certain stores, and they could evaluate stores and such. But over masses of points, that becomes relevant. And if you do it consistently, that becomes your scoreline. Others will do things with proxy evaluations of empathy. For example, how well do you think your superior listens to you? Do you feel that your voice is heard? Or are other ways of sort of decoding what is empathy and the way you express that within your culture, that's sort of part of what you're crafting and your owning of the idea. Then do you put it into your evaluations at the year end? Do you make a difference in the way you remunerate based on the score or not? So it becomes a real leadership question. And how much do you really believe in it? Because if you don't do it. You've got to somehow make sure that you are the number one convinced person about its value, that you move from being a know-it-all to a learn-it-all kind of attitude, that you're genuinely curious about other people's lives and their contexts. Because if it's merely just to make a better transaction, well, you'll be snuffed out for being inauthentic very quickly. It's a very human quality.
How do you bring up the topic of improving empathy in the boardroom if, as you said earlier, there's no clear ROI on this? I would have thought that there needs to be, and there ultimately would be if you get it right. But if you're saying that there isn't, how do you raise that on their priority from it's a nice to have to we must have? Because there's going to be lots of other competing topics that you're going to be competing with, and your job is to get into that top 5. So they say we're going to discuss this. Otherwise, it will always stay on that list.
Yeah, there's no straight answer. This is like wanting to have an attribution model that's perfect when it includes off and online. And the reason why I started with this piece about strategy and then thinking about how the empathy can work for strategy, that is the closest I can really get to linking to an ROI. Fact is, how do you measure love? I mean, how do you measure your grandma's affection?
Yes.
What scale is that?
Yeah.
Or a adoring kid's eyes.
Yeah.
Well, what are we doing? We have to measure that? Just because you can, should you? And I don't think it's really possible to measure it perfectly. It's an messy, imperfect world.
So are you saying then that it is incorporated as part of the organization's strategic thinking to say there's very few companies that would say we're not interested in having a strategic company or strategic positioning, and you're saying that empathy is an essential part of having the right strategy?
Well, I wouldn't go quite so far.
Right,
Yeah,
okay.
I would say that once your strategy is dead clear, then the question is, where can empathy play a role? Because generally speaking, empathy can play a role everywhere. It's the human quality. I mean, just like relationships are everything, empathy is a strong part of having strong, lasting, and genuine relationships. So if you can, if relationships are important to you, then you will be able to hopefully apply yourself and be more genuine. I think I wanted to mention something else just before, which is that a really good place to start is with vulnerability. Right. As the boss, and when you do that, when you say, hey, listen, you guys, listen, I've been thinking about our strategy and thinking how we improve our relationships with our employees or our relationships with our suppliers or whatever the strategic issue or the imperative is. And, I realized a few times I've been a little curt, or I could have been better, and the other day I was having a conversation with my wife and I realized I came home and I was a little bit abrupt, and that didn't make me feel good. I think it made me wonder just about how much more empathic I could be, and maybe we could be as an organization. The idea of that, showing that vulnerability, gives access to or opens up the possibilities for others also explaining that they're not perfect. But it's because if the boss doesn't start off with that, everyone still feels like they're going to be penalized if they bring up any of their imperfections. And when you sort of want to create a culture where people feel engaged into it. Long-term loyalty, you can measure long-term loyalty over time, but you're not going to be able to give me a 3-month, or generally speaking, a 3-month measurement on long-term loyalty. Creating bonds that last through fights, being able
Yes.
to feel that my work is meaningful. These are very hard things to put an ROI on.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, really where I feel like there's a lot of benefits to is creating that engagement at work. And by the way, trying to soften or remove whenever possible some of the mental health dangers that happen because of the stress, because of the anxiety, and because of our much greater awareness of this issue. It's a fact that country by country, something like 25% of the young people coming into the workplace are suffering from anxiety or depression. And so if you want to have a thriving workforce, you need to be addressing that. And empathy will be core within that. And then down the road, you're going to be able to see we're a place that's easy to recruit to. We're a place where people stay. We're a place where people year over year say, I like working here. I recommend this place. It's like the return on influence or having the word of mouth. You can't impose these things, but if they're part of the long-term strategic project, I'm sure that empathy needs to be part of it. And hopefully by bringing awareness about it, by being vulnerable and showing that I want to improve, and then having the time, because you need to change some things in order to have a more empathic culture than you have today. Because, you can't just sort of slap it in.
No. Yeah, that's a good point. Having a better understanding, more of a focus on empathy, I think will lead people to see that from a common sense perspective, if you've got a more engaged workforce, if you've got a workforce that are feeling less under pressure, they're going to be happier, they're going to be more effective. But also, going back to the point that we had earlier, was looking at customers and partners. A decision, even in B2B, I know is 90 to 95% emotional. Part of that emotion, how you feel about when you're dealing with that company, part of that is the empathy, feeling that you've been listened to, feeling that they understand you, and that they've been courteous. That is going to have a big effect, and ultimately that will have. But you're right, it's something that's very difficult to measure. But the common sense conclusion of understanding empathy and thinking about its effects will lead you to believe that it is something that we've got to address.
I had a phenomenal experience in Chicago about a month ago, where I was invited to run a roundtable with 25 CEOs from the beauty industry. And they were somewhat small, let's say $10, $20 million to several billion dollar companies. So we could say there were some very important, very busy people. I mean, of course, they're bigger, but that was in the room. And what I did is I invited the CEOs, tables of 5, to listen to one another. 2 things happened. The first was, oh my gosh, I'm not really that good at listening. And the method that I employ brings that out. And then the second thing was, well, it was really interesting because, first of all, I got to hear the quiet people. And second of all, I felt like I connected with these people through listening. And I think a lot of CEOs would benefit from having that experience, because it's not, you can read about listening and empathy all you want. You can read my book, and unfortunately, I don't think it's going to work overnight.
No.
But having that experience, that moves you, that the emotion, the emotion moves you, because all of a sudden you have the serotonin hit, you're feeling connected with somebody else because you're listening. Those type of bonds are priceless. And on top of that, thanks to the listening, you're probably going to be a lot faster or more effective anyway afterwards.
What are some of the questions that you think an organization should be asking of itself regarding empathy to perhaps raise that awareness?
Well, I suppose if it's not on your radar, see where it is in your business, and do some sort of inventory of it. Maybe call in your HR and say, hey, listen, I was reading this book on empathy and I was thinking it would be interesting. What do you think about empathy? Where is it in our organization? How do we evaluate it? Do we have any bearings on it? And maybe that's a good way to start about, because you really need to start thinking about it really fundamentally on your strategy and inside out. And that's where I think that'd be my starting point. And of course, you can always read the book.
Yes. And so what's next for you? So you've republished, you've updated this book. We've now got this very exciting time with AI. What are you going to be doing over the next few months and years?
Well, thank you for asking that, Mark. I must say I've also translated this book, Heartificial Empathy, into French, and my last book on leadership into French. So I'm going to be parling a lot of Francais as well in this same zeitgeist. So that's a lot to be dealing with right now. I'm also writing a book, which I've been doing in an experimental way. At least that's what it feels like for me. I got to thinking about what would it have been like to write in the 19th century a chapter a week and publish it in the local journal, local newspaper. And I was like, that's a different kind of writing. I usually write a book in a slug of time with an editor, and then hallelujah, it's published. So since the end of January last year, I've been publishing once a week a sliver of this book on conversation, and my idea, I call it dialogos, and the idea here is to reinsert meaningful conversation into our homes, society, and at work. Meaningfulness for me is all about making sense, making meaning, and bringing meaningfulness into what we do, because that's where the energy comes from. So the book is called Dialogos, or at least currently. We'll wait till what the publisher says, but
yes,
because I've been publishing this every Thursday at 5 p.m., a slug of it, and I've up to about 300,000 words, something like 66 different chapters. And the word dialogos is naturally a little bit of a play on my last name. I'm not going to hide that from you. But it's also dialogue. And the word logos is a hat tip to Viktor Frankl, and he who was the creator of logotherapy. And the idea of logo is not a brand logo. It's the idea of meaning in Greek, logos. So dialogos is actually about having meaningful conversations. What are their roles? Where can we have them? And how can we have them? And I've had this extraordinary journey, Mark, of discovering people who have spent their lives having conversations in ways that are different from me, and learning from them. So I've been so excited to discover new ways of having conversations. You would have thought it was basic, but it turns out there's so many other conversations that I've not been privy to. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. One is a Native American Indian, Barney, who explained and wrote up how she communicates with her ancestors 7 generations ago. What does that conversation look like? I have a evangelical minister who has been an advisor to several of the last presidents of the United States. What does that conversation look like? What does his conversation look like with God? Because it's not my world, but I wanted to explore how that kind of person who's, is at a pinnacle of a religion, how does he have his conversation? And again, I'm not religious, but it's just interesting to explore how other people have other religions or other conversations. And I just recently got off a call with a member of a quartet. They've been together for 31 years, and they have created such a bond. I wanted to hear how they talk through their instruments, how they talk when they play. What does that conversation look like? And it turns out it's note by note. Anyway, gorgeous stuff for me to think about, and the value of the silence, the rest. and all these other things which you can bring back into our daily lives. Anyway, that's what I'm writing and will be hopefully publishing at the end of the year.
I've got a question for you, actually. This is sort of a personal one, something that's been highlighted to me recently, and I've become aware and quite concerned. I was recommended by a friend to join an app called Nextdoor. I don't know if you're familiar with it,
Yes.
but it's connecting local communities. And for the most part, I think it's very, very good. It's telling you what's going on in the community and helping to create a bit of a bond. But one of the downsides that I see, and it seems to be amongst older people, is that they're also seeing more of the less positive aspects within the community of crime and antisocial behavior, because it's being highlighted to them that previously it's gone on, but they wouldn't necessarily know about it. So when anything happens in the community, from serious crime to something very, very minor, they instantly see it, and their perspective changes. And the conversation on social media, and this is what made me think of you, can become very negative because of that perspective. And things that I see is nowadays, with crime rates so high, with the way nowadays in the way that people behave to others. But the reality, and I've looked into this, is that the crime rate in this area and everywhere in the UK, there's been much higher in the past. In the 1990s, for instance, crime was much higher, but we didn't have social media and we weren't as aware of it. But to the extent, because the downside of this is some older people seem to be almost afraid to go outside, whereas in reality, the likelihood of them having a problem, particularly where I live here in Hertfordshire, is very, very low. But their perception is there's danger everywhere. How do you improve the communication on that social media? Because I've actually written and responded saying, actually, the facts are that the crime rate in this area is very low. Here are the stats. But there are some people, and I think it's part of a natural cognitive bias that we have called declinism and rosy retrospection, where you look back into the past and you remember all the good things, and then you look into the future and you see it as being, very negative. How do you improve the communication, the dialogue that you have on social media to overcome that?
Well, on social media is a little bit the tricky part because it depends on which social media and the culture within it. Because if it's 280 characters and it's public, there's all sorts of other dynamics that be going into it. And frankly, there was nothing that happened on this street today.
It is not news, is it?
It doesn't feel like it's really worthwhile.
No.
And so I would say one is to apply some empathy in understanding why this is happening. And my belief is that a lot of this has been because a high degree of narcissism, a high degree of egotism, egocentric thinking about, well, it's all about me and my safety. So we've changed the scale of what's acceptable in terms of safety. So if a kid scuffs his knee, well, that's a bad thing. Whereas in the past, let's say the rosy past, we're like, well, that's life. Get on with it.
Yes.
So we've created a culture that is more worried about me, worried about my feelings, and not about the community. And so when you render it down to me and my worry, my fear, the amygdala kicks in. I'm going to start reading things, and then all of a sudden I start getting wired for stuff. And we talk about the anxiety. I talked about the anxiety and the depression. It's just self-fulfilling material to re-encourage me to hide behind, not connect with people, not connect with my family, not connect with my community. And it's definitely a worry for me as to how can we bring that back out. And I think you just put the nail on the head, hit the nail on the head with the notion of perspective. Really what we need to be communicating out is perspective. It's not going to be news, but it's more analysis. Do you realize that 5 years ago, this was the situation? We've had a death from somebody with COVID, but that is 1 out of 100,000 And let's put some perspective on this COVID story, because the way it was managed in so many places, and by the media in particular, was to monger around fear, which I would say as civilians, just sucked it up.
Absolutely. Yes.
So Hans Rosling, I don't know if you've ever read Hans Rosling, but he talks about factfulness, and he talks about those biases that you were mentioning. He before he died, he wrote this book. It's a really interesting read, and I highly recommend it. It's about doing some proper homework. So
Yes.
encouraging maybe the neighbor to not just read your analysis and your perspective, but encouraging people to do their own, because then they own it.
Yes. Interesting you say that, because I had been quite concerned, and I thought, is there any part that I can play? And I did a little bit of research, because there was several people, one particular in particular, commenting that they felt safer when they lived in London in their childhood, and that nowadays they feel scared when going out. And I said, well, and I went away and did some research. I said, here's some analysis on the data, which shows that actually in London now, you're half as likely as coming up with any violence or being murdered than you were in 1990. It's halved. It's not increased, which is their perspective. And crime in this general area where we're living, again, has decreased over a number of decades. There's always fluctuations, and there are changes in the type of crime, but overall, we're less likely to come across crime or a dangerous situation. And their response was, all of that data's lies, and the government are lying to us.
Well, there's an interesting and very important point, is that facts won't overcome emotions.
No.
And so the reality is, for example, that individual, if they were in the 80s in London, they're probably of a certain age.
Yes.
And their lives has changed, and their speed with which they can run away from a
Exactly.
yobbo.
They're feeling more frail and fragile because of
That's
aging.
it.
Yeah.
And so
Yes.
that's where we lean into this.
Yes.
And so you need to recognize that, let them be heard, and try not to just bombard them with stats, but bringing perspective is also around the sort of the philosophical element around how we as a society are viewing safety, and how we as a society have moved away from the Second World War generation to the society where we now overemphasize mental health issues. We overemphasize feelings, and maybe that's a discussion piece, as opposed to a prescribing, it's not this anymore, because that's what they're feeling. It's sad that everything's just by feelings, and facts don't count. But if you ignore that fact, it'll be difficult to sway them and bring them into the fold.
My approach was that I responded back to these people, and there were a number, by finding alignment where I could, and saying, I can understand, your concern, I can see, and then introducing what I'd genuinely gone out to find. I didn't have a particular agenda. I mean, if it was higher, if crime was higher, I had a feeling that it wasn't, but I wanted to get the hard data. I was trying to explain to them, I've got no agenda here. I wanted to just try and do that research. And maybe
It's a great idea, by the way, Mark, to go and say, I agree with you this, or, oh, that's really cool, I'm learning something from you, thank you for teaching me that.
Yes.
Because I didn't know that.
Even if I didn't agree with their point, I my approach was, I can empathize with your feelings, and I may not agree totally, but I can see being fearful is not a great place to be. And seeing all of this on social media about what's happening, what seems very close to you, can create fear. I appreciate that, but bear in mind that it's probably less so than it was in the past.
That but is where it gets tricky.
Yes, that's right. Yes, and I'm probably not the best at that, because I'll tend to sort of, sort of write in a more business style. These are the facts, sort of thing.
Well, things like, what would it take for you to feel safer? Puts the onus back on them to think, well, what I'd like is to have more bobbies in the street. Okay, so Right.
Yes.
So you want that?
We
Then
had that exact example, and then I went and did some research, and that's proven not to reduce crime. Where they've tried that as an experiment,
uh,
and they have more police on the beat, it doesn't do anything to crime at all.
well, at least you're talking about the solution as
Yes,
opposed to just a number. Because if
yes,
you just throw them less crime, yeah, but I don't feel any different. That's not going to help me feel or less scared.
mm,
Just because this other guy, Mark Edwards, tells me it's 50% less. And of course, I'm just being a little devil's advocate in
sure.
this,
Yeah,
but
no, that's
these are the
fine.
types of conversations we need to be having.
Yes,
And probably it's hard to do it in a repartee version on social media.
mm.
I say this, you say that. And it's sort of,
It can end up
it's
polarizing people where they dig
yeah,
in on
yeah.
their opinion, and that's a problem. I can see that. Yeah, it's a tricky topic, and one that I think we could discuss for a lot longer. Um, Tell us
Indeed.
if we want to get a hold of your book, what's the best way?
Well, so Heartificial Empathy is currently, I set it up it's self-published on Amazon, but shortly enough, it'll be distributed on everything, but it's available in paperback and Kindle versions. The audiobook is only of the first edition for those who prefer audio. I'm considering trying to get it onto do it in audio as well. Otherwise, my new book, if you will, on dialogue is being published on Substack. The address is minter.substack.com. It's called Dialogos. And for the rest, everything I've been writing about the documentary, The Last Ring Home and such, all available on my Google-friendly website called minterdial.com.
Super. And if somebody wanted to reach out to you, is that the best way to go to minterdial.com?
Yep, you got contact me there. You can find me on Twitter. I generally respond to everything I come in, unless it's some sort of spammy, horrible, unempathic message.
I can see that what you do could be very applicable to a lot of the software vendors, people who are creating solutions, and particularly now where they're starting to incorporate AI. Is that sort of work that you'd be interested in hearing about?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, it used to be software was like a thing you had in your business.
Mm,
It's now everything with the cloud and everything.
mm,
And technologies in general, AI is obviously speeding up, which is one of the three reasons I had to rewrite the book. And the anthropomorphization, or let's say the humanization of AI, is going to be a key element that's long been considered. But obviously, if you're thinking about making your AI or your communications with your clients better, there's so many ways to do that, both within the human to human elements and with AI. And so it's a topic I'm deeply passionate around. I really enjoy working with companies that are genuinely committed to this idea, and obviously it's about personal trust and whether they like my gig and whether they want me to be helping them. I've done a lot of work in business. I'm not specialized in software, but I have been working alongside Pegasystems in particular, for example. Also been hired by Google and Samsung, amongst other tech companies, Tencent even in China,
oh, okay.
um,
Yeah. Some
Voodoo
good
maybe,
names.
but yeah.
Great. Well, it's a very interesting topic, and I think your timing is perfect at the moment. So I wish you well with the book and with your future work. And I hope some people listening to the podcast today reach out to you as well and give you
Oh, my
other
pleasure.
opportunities.
Thank you
Thank you very
so
much for
much, man.
coming on. Enjoyed
Appreciate
the
it very much.
conversation. Super. Thank you very much.